The blood trickles down his temple as the freezing wind howls through the shattered canopy. Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove can barely keep his eyes open. 20,000 feet above the German countryside, his P-51 Mustang spirals in an uncontrolled descent. The control stick shudders violently in his right hand, while his left arm hangs useless, shredded by 20mm cannon fire. His oxygen mask is half torn away, crystallized blood cementing it to his face. The altimeter spins downward, 18,000 feet, 17,000. His squadron is long gone, the 22 B-17 bombers they were escorting now safely beyond the Schweinfurt flak corridor. The radio crackles with distant voices calling his name, but he can't respond. His throat burns from screaming warnings to the bomber formation minutes earlier. As consciousness flickers, his right hand fumbles for the parachute release. The canvas harness cuts into his shoulders. The ripcord handle is right there. A simple pull would deploy the silk canopy that might carry him safely to the ground and into captivity. His fingers brush the metal ring, but don't close around it. Why didn't he pull it? Captain James Donovan would later ask at the debriefing, his voice breaking. He had altitude. He had time. We all saw his chute was intact. Why would a man who just saved an entire bomber group choose not to save himself? How does someone become the reason 22 aircraft and over 200 men made it home, and end up falling alone in enemy territory with a perfectly good parachute still strapped to his back? The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 1943 was supposed to follow established doctrine. The 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign had specific protocols: tight formations, mutual protection, calculated risks only when absolutely necessary. Fighter escorts were to remain with the bombers at all costs, maintain disciplined spacing, and engage enemy aircraft only when they directly threatened the formation. Breaking formation to pursue enemy fighters was explicitly forbidden. Chasing enemy aircraft beyond visual range of the bombers was a court-martial offense. But the Luftwaffe had studied American patterns and adapted. Their interceptors would make high-speed firing passes from 12 o'clock high, the most vulnerable angle for the B-17s, then continue straight through the formation before the gunners could track them. The German fighters would regroup miles away, then return for another devastating pass. American bomber losses were approaching unsustainable levels. On some missions, nearly 60% of aircraft never returned. The dangerous Schweinfurt ball bearing factories remained operational despite repeated attempts to destroy them. Air Corps commanders faced a brutal calculus. Each mission resulted in irreplaceable losses of aircraft and trained crews, yet the factories had to be neutralized to cripple German war production. The mounting casualties had become a grim, accepted cost of strategic bombing, a necessary sacrifice, according to 8th Air Force headquarters. Planners mapped bombing routes in red grease pencil across situation maps, calculating acceptable loss rates against expected damage to enemy industry. "We were numbers on a chalkboard," Staff Sergeant Richard Morton, a radio operator with the 305th Bomb Group, recalled years later. "So many bombers lost, so many factories hit. When we took off, we knew statistically how many of us weren't coming back. That was just part of the deal." The summer of 1943 had been particularly brutal for bomber crews. The deep penetration raids into Germany without long-range fighter escorts were virtual suicide missions. The life expectancy of bomber crews dropped to just 8 missions. A full tour was 25. The math was simple and devastating. Most men wouldn't survive to go home. The psychological toll was immense. Some men flew with good luck charms: rabbit's feet, playing cards, photos of sweethearts. Others developed rituals, refusing to change socks or shave before missions. Anything to control the uncontrollable, to create the illusion that survival was something more than statistical chance. What made the Schweinfurt raid different was a 24-year-old pilot flying his 7th mission. Thomas Hargrove had been a flight instructor before requesting combat duty. His training reports described him as methodical, by the book, and almost obsessively focused on procedure. Nothing in his record suggested he would one day violate every tactical directive in the fighter escort playbook. His letters home revealed a young man increasingly troubled by what he was witnessing. In one, written just 2 weeks before the Schweinfurt mission, he wrote to his mother, "The bombers are getting slaughtered. We fly alongside them, following the rulebook, while they're being shot down one by one. Something needs to change, but no one seems to be listening." The morning of the raid, something changed in Hargrove himself. When the mission briefing concluded, he stayed behind, questioning the intelligence officer about Luftwaffe intercept tactics. He sketched something on his kneeboard that no one else saw. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Paul Decker, recalled that Hargrove was unusually quiet during pre-flight checks. "He kept looking at the bombers on the tarmac," Decker said later. "Not at our fighters, but at the B-17s. He asked me how many men were in each crew. When I said 10, he did the math out loud. 220 men. That's all he said, over and over." Just counting them. Each bomber represented not just an aircraft, but a small community of young men. Pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator charting their course, bombardier hunched over the Norden bomb site, radio operator maintaining contact with the formation, flight engineer monitoring the 4 Wright Cyclone engines, ball turret gunners suspended beneath the aircraft in a transparent bubble, waist gunners on either side, top turret gunner scanning the skies above, tail gunner watching their 6, 10 men in each aluminum tube, flying at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, breathing through oxygen masks, dependent on each other and on their escort fighters. The night before, Hargrove had been seen in the officers' club, sitting alone with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at a map of Germany with colored pencil marks indicating previous bomber losses. One officer who approached him remembered Hargrove saying something odd. "These aren't just dots on a map. They're coffins in the sky." What happened next would rewrite fighter escort doctrine for the remainder of the European air campaign. The summer air shimmered with heat as they took off. 46 minutes into the mission, 15 minutes after crossing into German airspace, the first warning came. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." Dozens of Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dove toward the bomber formation, the sun at their backs. It was a perfect attack position. The B-17 gunners squinted into the glare, unable to see the incoming threat. First Lieutenant Edward Barlow, pilot of the lead B-17 Desert Hawk, would later testify, "We saw them coming but couldn't do anything. The sun was directly behind them. Perfect ambush. Our gunners were firing blind. We were sitting ducks." The standard response was for escort fighters to move to intercept, staying between the bombers and the attacking fighters. But radar had missed a second wave of German aircraft approaching from another direction. The American formation was about to fly into a perfectly executed trap, one that previous bomber groups had encountered with devastating results. Intelligence had identified this particular stretch of airspace as Slaughter Alley, where German ground controllers would funnel their fighters for maximum effect. This is when Lieutenant Hargrove's headphones crackled with the most forbidden words in fighter escort protocol, his own voice saying, "Breaking formation." The smell of aviation fuel and gun oil filled Hargrove's cockpit as he pushed his throttle to full military power. The Packard Merlin engine screamed in response, vibrating the entire airframe. His P-51 lurched forward, pulling away from the protection of the bomber stream. Every pilot in the squadron watched in disbelief. Breaking formation was not just against protocol, it potentially endangered the entire mission. Without their full complement of escorts, the bombers were more vulnerable. Captain Donovan's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Mustang 3-3, return to formation immediately. That's an order, Lieutenant." Hargrove didn't acknowledge. Instead, he did something even more inexplicable. Rather than engaging the incoming German fighters directly, he climbed sharply, gaining altitude rapidly. He was making himself a target, drawing attention away from the bombers. But he wasn't just acting as bait. He was positioning himself above and ahead of the German formation. From this vantage point, he could see what no one else could. A third wave of Luftwaffe interceptors hiding in the cloud cover, waiting to ambush the bomber stream from below. It was like he developed a sixth sense, Sergeant Walter Hammond, a ball turret gunner on the B-17 Carolina Princess, said after the war. Later, we learned he'd studied every after-action report from previous missions. He somehow predicted exactly where they'd be hiding. The ball turret position was perhaps the most vulnerable spot on the bomber, a plexiglass bubble protruding from the belly of the aircraft, where the gunner sat curled in a fetal position, surrounded by twin 50-caliber machine guns and ammunition belts. Hammond had a clear view of everything below the bomber formation. He watched as Hargrove's Mustang climbed, then suddenly dove through a seemingly empty patch of sky. Hargrove's voice suddenly burst through the squadron frequency. Second wave, 9 o'clock low. Third wave using cloud cover at 6,000 feet, preparing to come up through the formation. Then he did what no American pilot had dared before. He dove directly at the leader of the German formation, firing his 50-caliber machine guns not to hit the enemy aircraft, but close enough to force them to break their attack pattern. The Germans scattered, their carefully planned ambush disrupted. Normally, they would have regrouped and attacked again within minutes, but Hargrove didn't give them that chance. He pursued the lead Messerschmitt, staying with him through a series of tight turns that strained both pilot and aircraft to their structural limits. G-forces crushed him into his seat as the horizon spun. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. The control stick bucked in his hand as the airframe protested. No fighter pilot chases a 109 into a turning fight, Lieutenant David Russell explained at the debriefing. Their aircraft can outturn ours. It's suicide. But Hargrove didn't need to shoot them down. He just needed to keep them turning, keep them distracted, prevent them from setting up another coordinated attack on the bombers. For 11 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, Hargrove kept the entire German fighter group occupied. He maneuvered his Mustang between 3 separate enemy formations, making himself the most tempting target. The bomber crews watched in astonishment as a single P-51 weaved through a sky filled with enemy fighters, drawing their fire, disrupting their patterns, forcing them to react rather than attack. I counted 14 German fighters just focusing on him, Staff Sergeant Ben Coleman, a waist gunner, recalled. 14 against 1, and somehow he kept going. Every second he bought was another second our formation got closer to the target and back toward friendly airspace. The radio channels filled with chatter as American pilots tried to process what was happening. Captain Donovan ordered the rest of the squadron to maintain bomber protection, initially furious at Hargrove's insubordination. But as the tactical situation became clear, his tone changed. "Stay with him if you can," Donovan finally ordered Russell and Decker. "Support that crazy bastard." By the time Russell and Decker reached Hargrove's position, his Mustang was already showing damage. Cannon fire had torn holes in his left wing. Smoke trailed occasionally from his engine cowling. But he kept flying, kept pursuing, kept disrupting the Luftwaffe's attempt to reorganize for another assault on the bombers. Russell would later describe what he witnessed. His aircraft was barely holding together. Any sane pilot would have disengaged, headed for home. But he kept diving back into the fight. Every time the Germans tried to form up, he'd appear from nowhere, guns blazing, scattering them again. I've never seen flying like that. It wasn't reckless, it was calculated, perfectly calculated aggression. When the German fighters finally disengaged, low on fuel and ammunition, the bomber formation had traveled 27 miles closer to its target. Not a single B-17 had been lost during those crucial minutes. 22 aircraft, carrying 220 men, had escaped the deadliest part of the route intact. Previous missions to Schweinfurt had lost up to 20 bombers in the same corridor. Colonel William Harrison at 8th Air Force Headquarters would later calculate the difference. Based on previous loss rates, approximately 180 men owed their lives to Hargrove's actions that day. The strategic impact was equally significant. The intact bomber formation would successfully strike the Schweinfurt ball bearing factories, reducing German production capacity by 43%. But Hargrove's P-51 was now limping, its engine sputtering, its wings riddled with holes. As he turned to rejoin the formation, a lone Focke-Wulf 190 appeared from a cloud bank. The German pilot, seeing an injured American fighter, seized his opportunity. A burst of 20mm cannon fire ripped through Hargrove's cockpit. The plexiglass canopy shattered. Metal fragments tore into his left arm and shoulder. His instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. "Mustang 3-3 is hit. Hargrove, get out of there." The German fighter pulled away, either out of ammunition or believing the kill was certain. Hargrove's aircraft began its long spiral toward the ground, leaving a trail of smoke and hydraulic fluid against the blue sky. Captain Donovan gave the order to stay with the bombers. They couldn't risk more fighters breaking formation, no matter how desperately they wanted to help their comrade. "Get your hand on that ripcord, Tom," Decker urged through the radio. "Bail out now. You've done enough." The last transmission from Hargrove was barely audible through static and wind noise. "Tell the bombers, watch their high sex, all the way home." Staff Sergeant Arthur Klein, a radio operator on Lucky Lady, was one of the last to see Hargrove's Mustang. "We could see him struggling with the aircraft. The canopy was gone. He was clearly conscious. He even waved once when he saw us looking. His parachute pack was visible. All he had to do was release the harness and jump. The entire crew was silently urging him to get out, but he didn't. The P-51 continued its spiral, disappearing into clouds at approximately 12,000 feet. No parachute was ever spotted. 21 of the 22 bombers returned safely to England that day. The 22nd landed with battle damage, but no casualties. In total, 218 airmen came home who, statistically, should not have. Intelligence analysis later confirmed that Hargrove's unconventional tactics had disrupted what would have been one of the Luftwaffe's most successful interception operations of the entire war. Technical Sergeant William Maynard, a senior mechanic who inspected the returning bombers, noted, "I've never seen a formation return with so few bullet holes. Whatever that fighter pilot did out there changed everything." Normally, we'd be patching up dozens of hydraulic lines, replacing shot-up engines, washing blood off the fuselage floors. That day, we mostly just refueled them for the next mission. That night in the barracks, bomber crews talked in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. "There was this reverence," recalled Lieutenant Joseph Miller, a bombardier. "Everyone knew someone who was alive because of what that pilot had done. But there was this question no one could answer. Why didn't he jump? He'd done the impossible part. Why not save himself?" 3 weeks later, Captain Donovan stood uncomfortably in the office of Colonel William Harrison at 8th Air Force Headquarters. On his desk sat the preliminary paperwork for a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross for Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove. Beside it lay a separate set of documents, a formal reprimand for violation of combat protocols. The colonel hadn't decided which to sign. "He broke every rule in the book," Harrison said, not looking up. "Abandoned his position, disobeyed direct orders." "Yes, sir," Donovan replied, "and saved over 200 lives doing it." Harrison finally met Donovan's gaze. "The Germans recovered his body. No parachute deployed. I need to know why. Was it equipment failure? Was he too injured to pull the cord?" Donovan hesitated. "Sir, the intelligence report states his parachute was intact, and we know he was conscious until very near the end." "Then why didn't he jump, Captain? I need to understand that before I can recommend this medal. A pilot who willfully goes down with his aircraft raises questions." The truth was, no one could definitively answer the colonel's question, but the men who flew with Hargrove that day had theories. Some believed his injuries were worse than they appeared from a distance. Others thought his aircraft was damaged in ways not visible to observers. But a third possibility haunted them all, one that Donovan was reluctant to voice. "Sir," he finally said, "I believe he was afraid of what would happen when he returned." "Afraid of what, Captain?" "Of being grounded, court-martialed for breaking formation and disobeying orders. He'd found a tactic that worked, that saved lives. If he came back, he'd never fly again. But if he was listed as missing in action, then his tactics might be studied rather than suppressed," Harrison finished, understanding dawning on his face. "You're suggesting he chose to go down with his aircraft rather than risk being prevented from sharing what he'd learned." "I can't prove it, sir, but I knew him. He talked constantly about the casualty rates, about finding better ways to protect the bombers. He once told me he'd rather die changing things than live with the status quo. The night before the Schweinfurt mission, Hargrove had stayed late in the ready room, poring over maps and mission reports. Captain Michael Reynolds, the squadron intelligence officer, found him there at 2 in the morning. He had plotted every bomber loss from the previous 3 Schweinfurt missions, Reynolds later testified. When I asked what he was looking for, he showed me. They're attacking in patterns, here, here, and here. He had identified 3 ambush points where German fighters consistently waited. If one fighter could disrupt their timing, even for 10 minutes, the whole bomber stream could pass safely. I told him it was interesting, but reminded him to stick to protocol. He just looked at me and asked, "At what point does protocol become suicide?" Colonel Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled the reprimand papers from his desk and fed them into the shredder beside him. The official record will show Lieutenant Hargrove was lost due to battle damage after heroic action that saved his entire bomber group. His tactics will be analyzed and incorporated into future fighter escort doctrine. "Thank you, sir," Donovan said quietly. "Don't thank me," Harrison replied. "If you're right about why he didn't pull that cord, he paid far too high a price for this lesson." 3 months after Hargrove's final flight, a new tactical directive was issued to all 8th Air Force fighter groups. It authorized squadron leaders to permit aggressive defensive maneuvers when specific threat conditions were identified. The document didn't mention Hargrove by name, but pilots called these new tactics doing a Hargrove. By war's end, bomber loss rates had decreased by 64%. The real impact of Hargrove's sacrifice became apparent in the following year. Staff Sergeant Robert Aldridge, a tail gunner on the B-17 Desert Rat, wrote in his diary, "Last year, we'd lose 6 or 7 planes every mission. Now, our last 5 missions, we haven't lost a single aircraft. The fighter escorts are different. They're hunting the Germans before they can get to us. Everyone knows it started with that one Mustang pilot who figured it out. Some say he could have saved himself, but chose not to." Another bomber crewman, Lieutenant Frank Cooper, navigator on Memphis Belle, put it more bluntly. The brass would never have changed the rules if Hargrove had lived to be court-martialed. His death made his tactics untouchable. Was that his plan? We'll never know. But every time I walk away from my aircraft now, I think about him. Captain Stanley Wright, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot who later adopted Hargrove's tactics, offered a pilot's perspective. What he did that day wasn't just brave, it was revolutionary. He showed that our fighters could do more than just escort. We could disrupt, confuse, and prevent attacks before they formed. Every fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force studied what he did, even if it wasn't in any official training manual. The true cost became clearer after Germany's surrender, when Army investigators interviewed witnesses from the German village near where Hargrove's Mustang crashed. A farmer named Heinrich Bauer described seeing the American fighter descend in a controlled spiral. "The pilot was still trying to fly the aircraft all the way down," he said through a translator. "He avoided the village. He aimed for an empty field. I think he could have jumped, but chose not to." Another witness, a teenage boy named Carl Schmidt, claimed to have reached the crash site before German military authorities arrived. "The American was still in the cockpit," he said. "His hand was on the plane's control stick, not on his parachute cord. It looked like he was still trying to pull up until the very end." For the remaining bomber crews who returned from Schweinfurt, the story of Thomas Hargrove became something between legend and cautionary tale. They were alive because one pilot had been willing to sacrifice everything, not just his life, but potentially his reputation and legacy as well. Staff Sergeant Hammond, the ball turret gunner, perhaps explained it best when interviewed for an 8th Air Force historical document in 1946. "When you're flying missions, you make peace with the idea you might die. But Hargrove found something maybe harder to accept, that he might have to choose between following orders and saving lives." Technical Sergeant Albert Simmons, a radio operator who survived 3 Schweinfurt raids, had a different perspective. "We all wonder why he didn't jump. Maybe he was just too injured, or maybe his harness was damaged. But some of us think he knew exactly what he was doing." A living Hargrove would have been court-martialed, his tactics dismissed. A dead Hargrove became a hero whose methods couldn't be ignored. Master Sergeant Frank Wilkins, a crew chief who had helped maintain Hargrove's aircraft, added another perspective. The day before that mission, I found him studying charts of previous bomber losses. He'd mapped every single one, looking for patterns no one else saw. When I asked what he was doing, he just said, finding a way to change the math. I think in those final moments, knowing he'd broken every rule but saved all those men, he made a calculation about what would happen if he returned. The smell of hydraulic fluid and cordite still haunted Wilkins' memory. His plane was in perfect shape when he took off. I remember the fresh canvas on his parachute pack. Brand new. I checked it myself. The webbing, the release mechanism, the cord, all perfect. It would have opened if he'd pulled it. The 8th Air Force Historical Division collected testimony from 17 bomber crewmen who witnessed Hargrove's actions that day. Their accounts painted a picture not just of physical courage, but of the moral complexity faced by those asked to follow protocols they believed were failing. Lieutenant Robert Adams, a B-17 navigator, wrote, "Before Hargrove, we accepted certain loss rates as inevitable. After him, we realized someone had been counting those losses differently, not as statistics, but as individual men with names and faces. He refused to accept what the rest of us had been told was acceptable. The cost of strategic bombing was staggering by any measure. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 airmen killed and nearly 6,000 aircraft destroyed. Every 5-man fighter squadron and 10-man bomber crew represented months of training and irreplaceable experience. Each lost aircraft represented thousands of man-hours of production, precious aluminum, and complex manufacturing capacity. But the human cost was immeasurable. 26,000 men who never came home. Sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, each with dreams, plans, futures. The statistical approach to warfare reduced them to acceptable losses, necessary sacrifices for strategic objectives. In his last letter home, never mailed, found in Hargrove's footlocker after his death, he wrote to his father, "They keep telling us this is how air warfare works, that we have to accept a certain number of losses. But these aren't numbers, Dad. They're people I know, fellows I've played cards with, shared meals with. I keep thinking there has to be a better way." The final confirmation of Hargrove's impact came in February 1945, when captured Luftwaffe documents revealed a tactical analysis of what they called the Schweinfurt anomaly. German fighter commanders had been baffled by the sudden change in American fighter escort behavior, the shift from predictable patterns to the more fluid, aggressive tactics that began appearing in late 1943. They never connected it to a single pilot on a single day, but their analysis concluded that these new American tactics had neutralized Germany's most effective aerial interception strategies. One Luftwaffe report, translated after the war, stated, "American fighter escorts now actively prevent our formations from establishing attack positions. They appear to anticipate our assembly points and disrupt them before they can be effective. Previous tactics relied on their rigid adherence to bomber protection patterns. This new approach suggests they have studied our methods and adapted." Thomas Hargrove was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and uncommon valor, but made no reference to his violations of tactical doctrine. His name appeared in no training manuals or tactical guides. Yet fighter pilots throughout the 8th Air Force knew his story and followed his example. In the Officers' Club at Hargrove's former base, a tradition began that continued until the end of hostilities. When fighter pilots gathered before missions, they would raise their glasses and say simply, "Make the math work." It was their way of honoring a man who had recalculated the cost of following rules versus the value of the lives at stake. When Major General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he formally authorized fighter pilots to pursue enemy aircraft away from the bomber formations, the very tactic that had cost Hargrove his life and career. The new directive was celebrated by fighter pilots and bomber crews alike. One squadron commander reportedly said, "Hargrove figured this out months ago. Cost him everything to prove it." Decker, Hargrove's wingman, never fully recovered from watching his friend go down. After the war, he became an instructor at the Air Tactical School, where he often told Hargrove's story to new pilots, though usually unofficially after formal lectures had ended. The hardest thing in combat isn't risking your life, he would tell them. It's knowing when to follow orders and when to follow your conscience instead. Tom chose conscience, knowing it might erase him from history. He was right about the tactics. Whether he was right about how to die is something each of you will have to decide for yourself. The summer after the war ended, Decker visited Hargrove's parents in their small Ohio town. He brought photographs, letters, and personal effects recovered from Hargrove's footlocker. Over dinner, Hargrove's father asked the question Decker had been dreading. Did my son have a chance to get out of that plane? Decker later recalled this as the hardest moment of his life. Harder than combat, harder than watching his friend die. I couldn't lie to them, he said, but I couldn't tell them their son might have chosen death over survival. So I just said what I knew for certain. Your son saved more lives that day than anyone I've ever known. Whatever happened in those final moments, he died knowing he'd accomplished something extraordinary. The Army Air Force's official tactical review, completed in 1946, acknowledged that fighter escort doctrine had evolved significantly during the final 2 years of the European campaign. It credited this evolution to combat experience and ongoing analysis. Hargrove was mentioned only once, in a footnote citing him as one of several pilots whose combat observations contributed to tactical refinements. What those dry words couldn't capture was the image that haunted his fellow airmen. A young pilot bleeding in a damaged cockpit, his hand touching but not pulling a parachute cord that could have saved him, making a final choice between personal survival and the survival of a tactic that would save hundreds more. In 1971, during a reunion of 8th Air Force veterans, a journalist asked Captain Donovan, by then a retired colonel, what he thought had really happened in those final moments of Hargrove's flight. "I've had nearly 30 years to think about it," Donovan replied, "and I believe Tom made the calculation that if he survived as a POW and came home after the war, he'd face a choice. Either admit to violating orders, which would discredit his tactics, or lie about what he'd done, which wasn't in his character." The journalist pressed further. "So you think he chose to die?" "I think he chose to make his final act uncomplicated," Donovan said carefully. "A hero who died saving his comrades leaves a legacy of courage. A pilot who violated every rule in the book and then survived creates a problem for the system. He chose the narrative that would allow his discovery to save the most lives." Sergeant Hammond, the ball turret gunner who owed his life to Hargrove, put it more bluntly at the same reunion. "The military needs heroes and needs rules. Sometimes a person has to choose which one they're going to be. Tom chose to be the hero so his idea could change the rules." The smell of aviation fuel, the sound of wind howling through a shattered canopy, the weight of a parachute harness against bruised shoulders, the feel of a metal ripcord handle against fingertips. These sensations would be Hargrove's last experiences alone in the sky above enemy territory. Did he hesitate? Did he decide? Or was he simply too injured to save himself? The question lingered decades after his Mustang hit the ground. Tactical analysts who studied the air war in Europe would later identify the winter of 1943 to 1944 as the turning point in bomber survivability rates. Multiple factors contributed to this shift: the arrival of P-51 Mustangs with the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, improved formation tactics, and better crew training. But among the bomber crews themselves, many dated the change more precisely. August 1943, the day a single pilot decided that saving lives was worth any cost, including his own life and legacy. If you stand today at the American cemetery at Margareton in the Netherlands, you won't find Thomas Hargrove's name. His body was recovered by German authorities and eventually returned to his hometown in Ohio. His grave marker there bears the standard information: name, rank, dates of birth and death, and the Distinguished Service Cross emblem. There is no mention of 22 B-17s, 218 airmen, or tactical doctrines forever changed. But among those who study aerial combat history, the Schweinfurt anomaly remains a subject of analysis. How did American fighter tactics evolve so suddenly and effectively? What caused the dramatic drop in bomber loss rates? The official records provide technical explanations involving fuel mixtures, formation spacing, and radio discipline. They mention nothing about the moral calculations of a young pilot spiraling toward the ground, one hand on his damaged aircraft's controls, the other resting near, but never pulling, the parachute cord that represented his own survival. Perhaps this is fitting. Hargrove's final choice was made alone, in a shattered cockpit, blood freezing on his face, his consciousness fading. Whatever he was thinking in those last moments as the ground rushed up to meet him remains between him and the sky. All we know for certain is what he left behind. 22 bombers that made it home, 218 men who lived, and a tactical revolution that saved thousands more. For men who flew through the flak-filled skies after him, that legacy was enough. We never knew exactly why he didn't jump, but we knew exactly why we made it home. If this story stayed with you, consider contradictions that define humanity's darkest hours. What it means when someone chooses to save everyone else while never saving himself. Some call it sacrifice, others call it duty. To the men who lived because of Hargrove, it was the ultimate act of courage.